Hello and welcome to the Bullion Tracker project. This is the first video in our 4-part series, and if you haven't already, please check out the introduction video that I've linked below, which provides more background on what this series is about. For the first part, we will get the current price of the metal, and to do that we need to do two things. The first thing is we need to research and find a data provider. And the second thing we need to do is build the Python class to get the price of the metal. So let's start with researching and trying to find a data provider. Let's start with searching for gold price API. And as you can see, there are lots of options here. There's metals-api.com, there's goldapi.io, there is xignite.com, and there are tons of options here, but the one that I signed up with is goldapi.io. And if you want to follow along, I recommend you do the same thing and just create an account here. But one thing I can say is it's always a good idea to create a throwaway email account to use for third-party services, especially in the beginning if you're just evaluating it. The main reason being privacy and to not get spammed. So once you have your email account set up, just click this button here, Get Free API Key. Now I've already signed up with them, so I have an account, and you'll see I'm signed in, and they provide 500 requests per month. So one of the reasons I signed up with them is because they have a really nice documentation page, as you can see. So they provide a API key, and we can see how to use the service. There are tons of code samples, so JavaScript, PHP, Python, so different examples for you to follow, and examples of what the response looks like. So now that we have an API key and examples of how to use the service, we are ready to start building the Python class. Now before we start coding, I want to create a repository. So I'm going to go to github.com and create repository. And you don't need to follow this step. I'm creating a repository so that we have a public project that you can download and look through the code. So let's create the repository. I'm going to call it Bullion Tracker, and we'll make this public. We'll add a README file and a Python gitignore, and we'll create repository. Now that we have the repository, I can clone it. So I'm going to copy this, open up my command prompt, go to the documents folder, and as with any new Python project, we always want to create a virtual environment so that we have an isolated environment where we can work safely. So let's create that. To do so, I'm going to do python-m venv and the name of the environment that we want to create. So we're going to call this Bullion Tracker env. And once the environment's been created, we can go into it and list the contents. So we can see that the environment's been created. We can initialize it by calling scripts activate. And we know that we're in the environment and that it's activated when we see our prompt prefixed with Bullion Tracker env inside parentheses. So now that the environment's been created, let's clone our project. I'm going to go back to the browser, copy this again, and paste. Excuse me, let me try that again. Copy and paste. And I'm going to do git clone. And that will clone the project into our environment. So if I look at the contents of the directory, we can see Bullion-tracker has been created. So I'm going to go into that directory. And for now, we don't really have anything in there. We have an empty README file and a gitignore with for Python. So if we look at the project requirements, we know that we need to talk to the data provider, so we need the Python library requests. So we're going to install requests, And I believe that's all we need for now. So let's go ahead and type pip install requests to install the requests library. And now if we do pip freeze, we can see that requests has been installed along with some dependencies. Now we want to store these dependencies into a file called requirements.txt. And to do that, I just call pip freeze right angle bracket and then requirements.txt. So we're storing the output of pip freeze into requirements.txt. And let's now make our first git commit. So I'm going to do git status to check, and we are currently on origin main. So I'm going to change the branch to our develop branch, and we'll just call this develop for now. So now that we have a develop branch and we have an unstaged file, I'm going to add that file, git add requirements.txt, and I'm going to commit it with a message, add requests to requirements.txt. So we now have created our first commit, and I'm going to push this to develop. And if we just double check and go back to our GitHub, we now have a develop branch that has the requirements.txt file. If we look inside, we can see the requests library dependency along with the third-party dependencies. So now we are ready to start coding. Let me open up my notepad. I'm going to create a new file and minimize these other ones. And let's first of all copy in some of the data that we need. So we know that we need the API key. That's how we identify ourselves to the service provider. So API key is this string. And we also know that we need the API resource, the endpoint. So I'm going to copy that. And let's read the documentation a little bit just to understand how to make the request. So let's look at the Python code samples. And so what we need to do is we need to provide our token as a header in our request. We then make a request to goldapi.io, and we make a GET request to the API resource or the endpoint, and then we provide XAU. So I think that's the metal. Yeah, XAU as a symbol and XAG as currency code. So XAU. Okay, so that's for getting the ratio of gold and silver. What if I just want to get the price of gold? Okay, here we go. So add API key to X-axis token header of your request. And then for metal, we can choose one of these. So we can choose XAU for gold, AG for silver, and then platinum, palladium. And for the currency, we use the currency code, so USD for United States dollars. Okay, so I think that's what we'll do. So let me copy this. And we'll call this the host. API host is that, and we know that the metal that we want is XAU, and we know that the currency we want is USD. and I think date is optional. So let's try to build our initial test. So I'm going to import requests, and we'll construct our header file, or the header dictionary. So for headers, I want to include the X access token header with the value of our API key, and then I'm going to make a request, and we want to do a get for that endpoint. So let's construct our URL. So it's going to be API host followed by API slash and the metal and currency. So the metal is gold and currency. So I think we should call this metal. And let me save this file to our environment, Bullion tracker, and we'll call this we'll call this tracker.py. There we go. Now we have some nice syntax highlighting. And so we want to make the request to the URL, and we want to pass in headers, and we want to then check the response. So save that, open up our command prompt, and clear the screen, and let's do Python space tracker.py, enter, and we got a response code 200 back. That means the response was successful. Now let's look for the response JSON. Save that and run. And we can see that we got the data back, but it's in a format that's hard to read. So what I like to do is I like to use the built-in JSON library, and instead of just printing out the Python dictionary, I like to pass this into json.dump_s, and then we want to dump the JSON as a string indented by 4 spaces. So if we rerun that, so there's a syntax error, so close this off, save and run. We get a much nicer output back. So the response JSON, let's take a look at it. We have a timestamp, we have the metal code, the currency, some additional data, and we get the current price. So $17.87 and 16 cents. Let's verify that by checking, I like to check kitco.com. So $17.87 and 70 cents. So $17.87 and 16, so it's close enough. I don't think this is, yeah, it's a spot market is closed. So I think that the actual price stops updating in real time. But we know that the API is working. Let's do a quick check for silver. So the code for silver is XAG. So I'm going to replace XAU with XAG, save, and if we run this again, we have a price of $22.69. So if you look at the Kitco page, $22.70. So we know it's working, and we have the initial proof of concept of this tool. So let's try to organize the code so that it's a bit more readable. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make this a little bit more generic. And to do that, I'm going to create a Python class. So let's start with creating a Python class, and we'll call this class tracker. And I'm going to move some of these into the class itself. So let's put it inside the class constructor. We know that we need the API key, so I'll move that in here. We also know that we need the API host, so we'll move that in here too. And let me reduce the font here so we can fit this a bit better. Okay. Now we have the API key, API host, so we don't need these two lines anymore. And let's move this to the top. And now we want to create our method that will actually do the query. So define, we'll call it get price. And then we can move this in here. Now we know that the headers will never change, doesn't matter what the metal is, so we can move the header into the constructor too. So rename this to self.headers and then fix this so that it's self.api key. And in fact, we know that the API key won't really be used outside of the headers, so we can delete this and just pass this directly into the headers dictionary. So that looks a bit better. Now, we normally don't want to hard code variables like this because the variable could change, the host name could change, and when something like this changes, it's not really code, and therefore we don't really want to make changes to the code. So that this should ideally be inside of a constants file or something that isn't actually in the code. And for sensitive data like the access token or passwords or whatever sensitive data that you have, you definitely don't want to hard code them into your class. So there are better ways of handling this, such as having the sensitive data as an environment variable that you then pull into your Python code. But we don't want to hard code them. But for in the interest of keeping this project simple, we're doing it this way. But in future projects, as the scope of the project gets more complex, I do want to show you how to do it correctly. But for this project, we're just going to keep things simple like this. In future videos, I will also talk about how to deploy our code to the cloud. And to do that, we'll use a tool called Ansible. And Ansible is great for provisioning our servers and to deploy our code. And it has a great feature where we can encrypt certain parts of our configuration, such as secrets, passwords, tokens, and so on. So any sensitive piece of data can be encrypted with Ansible Vault, and I'll show you how to do that in future videos. But for now, we're just going to hard code this into our Python class just to keep things simple. But I will show you how to do it correctly and deploy our code correctly to the cloud in future videos. So now that we have our headers initialized, let's refactor the getPrice method. And I'm going to start with creating some documentation. We'll add a doc string here. So this method will be to get the price of the metal, and we want the user to be able to provide the metal and the currency in. So we want the user to provide the metal and currency, and so let's document that also. So arguments, we know that we need a metal, and this is going to be a type string, and the metal needs to be in a certain format. So let's look at the documentation. So the metal needs to be in a particular format, and it doesn't really tell us what this format is called, so we'll just call it symbol. So going back here to the doc string, symbol of metal, and we'll give some examples. Like that. And the second argument is the currency, which is also a string, which is in the ISO 4217 format. So let's pass that in. Currency in format. Okay. this method should return the price, and it's not going to be a string, it's actually going to be a float, and this will be the price of the metal. All right, so we know what the method should accept and what the method should return. So let's go ahead and refactor this method. So the URL is self.api host, and let's replace metal with metal because that's what's passed in, and then the currency with currency. Okay, so we have the URL and we also have the headers, but we need to declare self.headers because that is where the header is defined. So self.headers, and everything else should be the same. So let's go ahead and run this, but because we need to instantiate the class, I'm going to do that now. So what I've done here is I want to ensure that when we run this code, this file tracker.py directly on the command line, that Python will run whatever we have declared in this block. And so __name __ this variable is created when we first initialize this file. When Python first runs this file, it creates this variable and it sets it to a particular string depending on how it's run. So if it's imported in a module, it'll be a certain string, but if it's being called directly on the command line, it'll set it to this string. And so this is how we detect if this tracker.py file is being called directly or if it's being imported by another module. And so we can control that using this this little code block here. So because I want this code to run if called directly on the command line, I'm going to use this here to then initialize the class. So t equals tracker. And then I'm going to call the getPrice method. So t.getPrice. And we need to pass in the metal and currency. So I'm going to say the metal is XAU for gold, and the currency is USD for dollars. And then we're going to pass that in, metal, currency. And by doing this, we should theoretically get the same output that we got back when we did the first test. So let's try that. I'm going to clear the screen and I'm going to run the file. And just like we expected, we got the response code back with a 200 successful, and then the response JSON back with the data for gold. So the current price of gold is, I'm sorry, this is for silver. So let's go back, look at our code. Oh, it's because we didn't save the file. XAU, save the file, rerun it. Okay, there we go. So we got the price of gold, which is $1,787. So this is working as expected. And then instead of printing this out, I want to return the price. So I'm going to return the price. Return the price. And I then want to print out the price. So I'm going to print price of currency is, excuse me, the price of the metal is currency, and then we'll pass in the price. There we go. And because this is a string interpolation, we're going to make this a f string. And let's run the code again. And so there we go. The price of XAU, or gold, is USD 17.87 and 16 cents. So we have created a Python class called tracker, which has a method called getPrice, which, if provided with a metal and currency, gives us the price of the metal, which is a decimal number. as you can see here. So I believe we have created the class that we set out to do at the beginning of this video. I just want to quickly test out some other metals. So let's create a list of metals. So XAU and also XAG for silver. And then let's just do a quick test here. So for metal in metals, I want to get the price of the metal. Save that, and let's clear the screen and run it again. Okay, so the price for gold is $17.87 and the price of silver is $22.69. Great. So we now have our Python class. We also know that it's working, and I believe if I go and look at the requirements, so let's open up the requirements file. So we had said initially that for this video we were going to research and find the data provider, which we did. So the data provider is goldapi.io. We also said that we were going to build the Python class, and using requests we were going to get the price for each metal. And so we've done just that. Now let me save this to the repository. So git status, and we now have an untracked file. So I'm going to add that. So git add tracker.py and commit there we go. So let me push this to, I think we called it develop. Yeah, develop, so git push. Okay, so we have saved our progress. If we look at github.com and we look at the repository, and then we switch over to the develop branch, you can see that our code is now tracked here in version control. So we have our code and our little test over here. So we have completed the first video, which was to find a data provider, goldapi.io, and then to create the Python class to get the price of the metal. For the second video, we will look at how to use SQLAlchemy to create a database and to save the price of the metal to the database. And then for the third and fourth videos, we will look at how to use that data to generate a chart and also how to schedule the checking of the prices. So thank you for watching, and if you found this interesting, please head on over to the second video and we'll look at how to work with the database.